Welcome to today's webinar on the legal compliance concerns with long-term remote work arrangements. My name is Amber Dodds, and I am a partner in the Labor and Employment Group at Bracewell. I am here with my colleague and friend, Bob Nichols, who is also a partner in our group. Having practiced for many years prior to the pandemic, and then through the pandemic, Bob and I worked with clients through the many aspects of transitioning workers to remote work, and now considerations of who and how to transition back to in-person work. Bob and I continue to hear questions from clients on remote work. What we are seeing and what we want to share with you today is a shift from some of the more immediate compliance concerns, which I will briefly review in a moment, toward the legal and practical concerns about ongoing remote work arrangements. Let me begin with what this webinar is not about. First, this webinar is not a debate or discussion on whether remote work is a good development or a bad development in the world of work. Remote work brings both benefits and challenges. Those consequences are different for various employers and employees based on a variety of factors. We certainly understand that there are competing concerns among employers and employees related to whether and how remote work is implemented in various workplaces, and we will not be addressing the validity of any of those concerns. We also understand that remote work is not an option for many positions. Second, this webinar, in the time that we have, cannot be a comprehensive review of all of the issues with long-term remote work arrangements. Instead, we wanted to raise some of the legal compliance challenges that we are seeing and considering for clients who implement long-term remote work arrangements, whether they be full-time remote work or a hybrid model. So let's dive in. What we are seeing both in studies and news coverage is a significant increase in remote work, even as the pandemic-related concerns that may have been the initial reason for this shift to remote work change. For example, a national poll conducted this year of 25,000 people by management consulting firm McKinsey & Company found that more than half, 58%, of workers had the opportunity to work remotely for all or part of the week. In addition to an increasing number of employees with the opportunity to work from home, we are seeing many of those employees working from home for most of the time. As you can see on the slide, a 2022 Pew Research Center survey found that 59% of workers who say that their jobs can mainly be done from home are working from home, quote, all or most of the time, end quote. With these changes, workers who choose to work from home are shifting their reasons for wanting to work from home. 76% say preference is a major reason they are working from home, which is up from 60% in 2020. 17% say a relocation from the area where they work is a major reason they telework, which is up from 9% in 2020. What does this increase mean in hard numbers? It's predicted that 36.2 million Americans will be working from home by the year 2025. With so many workers working remotely, many of you have already tackled the immediate compliance issues that I mentioned earlier, but I want to briefly review them now. These immediate issues include time compliance under the Fair Labor Standards Act and similar state laws for non-exempt employees, such as ensuring that non-exempt employees are recording all time worked, even checking emails after working hours. The applicability of state employment laws is a huge compliance concern as remote workers spread to states in which employers are not already operating. As these employees move, they may or may not be protected under the state laws of the states in which they live. Many state employment laws have minimum employee thresholds for applicability, which may or may not count only the employees in the state in which the employee is living. Other state employment laws are simply silent on coverage, so employers must assume that they apply. These state laws may introduce new entitlements for employees, such as paid sick leave requirements, meal and rest breaks, including not only what breaks must be provided, but in some instances at what time during the day the break must occur. Higher minimum wage at the state or local level, and overtime implications, including, for example, daily overtime. Another immediate compliance concern is employee reasonable accommodation requests. Not the request to work from home as the reasonable accommodation, but in how remote work is implemented. Not all employees will experience working from home in the same way. Some may need an accommodation. For example, technology enhancements or new software, different communication methods, or other creative solutions. Finally, there are tax implications of employees working in a different state. State income tax reporting, for example. Some states had passed laws allowing temporary remote work during the pandemic without state income tax withholding, but those have widely expired, leaving in place requirements for state income tax withholding. Registration for unemployment and state-paid family and disability leave programs. Even business registration in states if the employee's presence results in the company doing business in the remote employee's residence state. Many of you have, and likely still are, working through these immediate compliance concerns. But I want to shift now to the legal concerns that are raised over time, and I'll turn to Bob for our first topic on facility safety.
Thank you, Amber. Both Amber and I work on OSHA matters. In my case, I have had a very active, essentially a daily OSHA practice for the last 33 years. I've been involved in innumerable OSHA inspections, contested citation cases. And one thing that I've learned over the course of those 34 years that a critical part of safety is observation. And what I learned over the course of time since March of 2020, with the truly explosive growth of remote work, is whether I like it or not, or whether others like it or not, there is an unavoidable tension between remote work and workplace safety. Specifically, if members of facility or operations supervision or management, staff, are not present in the workplace, there is some negative impact over time on workplace safety. And you can understand if you read materials, including OSHA materials, about what makes for an effective safety and health program. I share with you on this slide a couple of quotes from OSHA that I thought were significant. First of all, OSHA recommends that supervisors, quote, should always be looking for hazards and hazardous situations as they perform their daily activities, close quote. So observation of potentially dangerous conditions, of non-compliant conditions, is critical to an effective safety program. Secondly, and separately, the presence of supervision in staff is important because visibility modifies employee behavior. And as OSHA indicates on their website, they recommend that company representatives, open quote, be visible in operations, close quote. So those are two separate and very important reasons why presence is critical to safety. I also want to note that if management representatives or EHS staff are present less, it could also have a negative impact on the opportunity for the employer in a particular case to assert what's called the unpreventable employee misconduct defense, which is the most common affirmative defense in defending OSHA citations. As many of you may know, there are four basic elements to that unpreventable employee misconduct defense: that the employer has established work rules designed to prevent the violation. Number two, the employer has adequately communicated the rules to its employees. That means training. Three, very importantly, the employer has taken steps to discover violations of the rules. And four, the employer has effectively enforced the rules when violations were detected. Well, obviously, the less members of management, facility management, operations management, and EHS staff are on site, the less opportunities there is for them to detect and make efforts to assure compliance with safety rules. A couple specific difficulties associated with remote work and safety is that managers are not around to receive reports as much directly from employees about safety concerns. Also, again, as we talked about, workers may feel that they can be more lax in their adherence to safety rules if they're not being observed. So what's some advice we have going forward? Well, first of all, I would say that, look, when you have people who have on-site operational safety responsibilities, while there may be an opportunity for them to engage in remote work, it has to be limited. And they have to spend most of their time out in operations, observing conditions, working with employees. There's limited safety work they can do effectively from their den or home office. You may also want to consider creating checklists and timelines for observations. For example, you may want to require staff or plant management to conduct regular walkarounds of facilities and operations if they don't already do it. I also want to say that I think in some organizations you've seen headquarters staff, white-collar employees, not at the plant or operations level, who are out observing operations and plant operations less since the pandemic changed our work habits. And that's not acceptable either. We can't allow remote work to keep people from visiting facilities and operations as much. The presence of those people is critical to enhancing the safety of the workplace. Again, you want to ensure that employees know who they can contact. I also want to make it clear that one critical thing is to make sure that you don't have multiple people making use of remote work or time off and leaving a facility with skeletal supervision or EHS staff so as to compromise safety. For example, if on a Friday between remote workers and people taking time off, you don't have adequate folks on site to assure safety and observe the workplace, that's unacceptable. With remote work becoming a long-term reality, all of you are going to have to work harder to assure safety in the workplace is not compromised by the concept of remote work. The bottom line is there's simply no substitute for being on site. Amber, let me turn things back to you.
Thanks, Bob. One major aspect of a high-functioning workforce is the ability to continually develop employees to increase their skill sets and knowledge. As a shift to remote work occurs, some ways in which this development of skills and transfer of knowledge changes, or frankly, can disappear. One significant example is that employees often learn by in-person observation. This may occur in circumstances that are not intended as teaching moments. Instead, it's absorbed by observing others performing their work, even when the observing employee is not part of the task at hand. It could be overhearing or seeing another employee complete a task while the observing employee is between tasks or taking a break. This type of inactive training is typically unplanned and can be difficult to recreate in the remote work environment. Another similar example is training that occurs at impromptu moments due to employees witnessing an event together or otherwise sharing an in-person experience. This type of experiential learning is a frequent teaching experience, one in which a difficult or novel situation arises, and employees both react to it together and make time afterward to discuss and review what happened and how they responded. While this type of reactive learning can certainly happen virtually, there are aspects of that learning that may be limited by the virtual environment. For example, employees may not be able to hear or see something virtually that they would have perceived in person. Even in planned meetings, employees participating remotely may find it more difficult to interrupt to ask a question that they may have asked, quote, by the water cooler. Some physical cues, such as body language, can cue meeting leaders to stop a meeting and provide an employee the opportunity to ask a question. These cues can be more difficult to read in a remote environment. Learning often occurs after a meeting ends which may or may not be facilitated when all participants sign off of a meeting virtually, rather than being physically present together. Finally, selection of mentors may occur naturally or differently when employees are physically present together. Of course, employees may make connections in the virtual environment as well, such as by observing another employee's sports team memorabilia or hobbies, which can be relationship building. So, how do employers encourage and support the experiential learning opportunities that may be missed or altered with remote work? First, approach training and mentoring with intentional planning and affirmative actions. Employers can create specific processes to review whether employees are receiving training and mentorship. This can include scheduling one-on-one sessions with employees, providing team building opportunities, and implementing periodic training sessions. Survey your managers on skills for which subordinates need additional development. While it can be difficult to identify what organic learning opportunities may not be occurring, managers may be better able to put their finger on specific skill sets that need training. The focus with this topic is that a decrease in experiential learning may not be obvious initially, but can exponentially grow over time. Another aspect of the shift towards remote work is to train managers on how to teach remotely, which may not come naturally to them. Just like employees may hesitate or not be naturally inclined to jump in virtually and ask questions, managers may not naturally be good virtual teachers and may need help identifying opportunities to teach in the virtual environment. Consider hosting in-person sessions to provide the time and space for experiential learning that may not occur remotely. With some intentional scheduling of in-person sessions, employers can create the environment in which experiential learning in person can occur. And just like asking managers to identify employee skill sets to be developed, employers can engage with remote employees about their training by asking employees what they do and do not feel comfortable doing in their work responsibilities. One counterpart to experiential learning and developing employee skill sets is performance evaluation, which can also be affected by remote work. One significant issue in the world of remote work is proximity bias, which is when employees who are in person are treated more favorably than remote employees. Proximity bias can be a perception, a reality, or both. It can be conscious or unconscious. Proximity bias can be conveyed in a variety of ways, including unintentionally. For example, employees who hear from a manager that this is a really important meeting, so we need to have it in person, may assume that their remote work is not valued or not considered to be important. One primary example of proximity bias is the assumption that a remote employee is not as productive or isn't working. That assumption may or may not be true. Can the manager point to specific examples of the employee not being productive or not meeting deadlines? Employers need to drill down on manager assessments. Is the issue that the employee is not meeting work expectations, or it's the manager's perception that the employee isn't working? Another primary example of proximity bias, including unconscious bias, builds on what Bob was discussing with facility safety, which is that what is seen is often what is paid attention to. So employees who are not routinely present in person, for managers who are physically present in the workplace, may be unintentionally looked over or forgotten, simply because it is human nature to pay more attention to what is directly in front of us. So how can employers address proximity bias? Just as with in-person work, managers must ensure that performance issues are being timely addressed and documented. Without consistent and progressive attention to issues, situations arise in which managers desire to take an employment action because the manager is frustrated, but no one has specifically addressed the issue with the employee. Managers simply cannot assume that employees must know there is an issue, especially when remote work may be impeding employee observation or communication. Rather than waiting until performance evaluations to address ongoing issues, managers must address issues as they arise. Waiting to address an issue blunts the effect of addressing it. Employees may think, well, it must not have been a big issue because the manager didn't timely address it. Also, not addressing an issue timely can lead to something else occurring in the interim, and the employee assuming that the issue was not the performance problem, but the other event that occurred in the interim. For example, an employee may think, it's actually my request for leave that's the issue, but the manager is pointing to something that happened before my request for leave as a cover to retaliate against me for requesting that leave. By forcing managers to directly address performance issues on a timely basis, employers can dispel potential proximity bias by evening the playing field for all. Another way employers can address proximity bias is to review and update job descriptions to set clear expectations of job requirements. This can be key for both employees and managers. It helps to set expectations for performance and gives managers something specific to point to when evaluating employees and directing employees on their performance deficiencies. Let me turn it back over to Bob for our next substantive topic, which is employment law compliance.
Amber, as we've all learned over the last 33 months or so, work from home, remote work creates unique employment law compliance concerns. The message I want to send today is that we have to recognize that dealing with those employment law compliance concerns is now not a stopgap concern for only the duration of the pandemic, but with remote work being part of our lives, certainly in the long term going forward, we have to continue to be vigilant about dealing with the employment law concerns inherent in remote work. For example, when people are working from home, as you know, there is the opportunity for lines between professional work life and personal life to be blurred, for standards of workplace conduct to be less clear. When someone is at their house and not in the office, you'll need to continue to safeguard against a lack of compliance in that regard. Obviously, with regard to discriminatory or harassing conduct, the fact that individuals are not in the workplace will continue to represent challenges. Often, HR or management is not there to see what occurs between individuals on a call or a conference. You don't have a set of individuals at a set of cubicles where they can be observed. These unique compliance concerns associated with remote work are going to continue, and you have to be ready. Let's talk about how you be prepared for that. If we can move to the next slide. The keys are policies and training. You're going to need to update your policies like your harassment policy. You're going to need to update your training like your anti-harassment training to incorporate concerns about remote work. For example, some of you have very good harassment training videos that you use with employees. Well, those videos and those training programs certainly need to be modified to, for example, address scenarios unique to remote work and harassment and employment law compliance. I also want to point out that in closing, that what I said about safety staff and the necessity that they be there, to be available, to be observed, to be seen, certainly also applies to HR staff. Undoubtedly, at many companies, HR staff will continue to have some limited opportunity for remote work. But the fact remains, what we've seen is it's critical that HR staff, for the most part, continue to be in the workplace where they can observe conditions and where they can be readily available to employees who want to speak with them, report concerns, report complaints. Individuals responsible for workplace compliance just are not in a position to spend most of their time working remotely if they're going to serve their employer effectively. Let me turn things back to Amber to talk about company culture.
Thanks, Bob. I want to shift now to a topic that's been in the news and is somewhat difficult to define, which is company culture. Generally, company culture is the values and practices of an employer that permeate its operations, mission, and public relations. Companies can have various levels of focus on building an internal culture for employees. For some, it's a significant element of their workforce communication and management. While the ability to work remotely is not generally a defining aspect of company culture, employer approaches to remote work may be considered by employees and applicants as a key element of that culture. Employers should determine what their culture is and how it relates to employee remote work, but culture should not be defined by their company's relationship with remote work. In other words, while remote work can be one of the many benefits that an employer provides, the defining goal of the company generally will not be remote work for its employees. There may be a culture of treating employees well, but this can be implemented through many avenues. So the question becomes how to implement a remote work practice that is consistent with company culture. In addition, the world of remote work continues to change as employers and employees learn more about working remotely. So a company's culture should not be defined by how it implements remote work. Some very real considerations for employers have already developed around remote work. For example, are employees working from home or living at work? Some employees express that working from home does not bring the desired time flexibility, but instead leaves them tasked with resetting boundaries between work and home that occurred more naturally when there's a physical distinction between office and home. The ability to set these boundaries is a skill set that not all employees have, and employees may not be comfortable or willing to ask their employer for help. This risks employee turnover due to burnout. On the other end of the spectrum, some employees may abuse remote work or simply may not be good at focusing and completing their work in the home environment. This brings a risk of disengaged employees who may lack motivation to complete their work, or distracted employees who are not working or who are working for other employers. Given these concerns, what are some practical considerations for employers regarding the intersection of company culture and remote work? First, create, modify, or continue a motivating and engaging culture that reflects company values. Then, implement your company culture through clear expectations about remote work. This can include positive messaging to employees about offering remote work as a benefit, but should also include listening to employees who may prefer to work in an office space or who need additional guidance regarding remote work. Second, consider intentional scheduling and communication about scheduling. This should include expectations about when employees must be online and engaged. If you want employees to be online and responsive from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., be clear about that expectation and hold employees accountable when they engage in non-work activities during that timeframe. Alternatively, consider messaging to employees about when they do not need to be immediately responsive, for example, late in the evenings. Another aspect of intentional scheduling can include a hybrid model to bring employees together in person, which can assist with several of the items we've already discussed today. Finally, be specific about your remote work requirements and be consistent in applying them. One issue many of you have already encountered is employee frustration regarding who gets to work from home. If you have specific remote work requirements and can articulate them, this can assist with clarifying why some employees are eligible for remote work options and what the parameters on remote work options are. Further, if you set clear expectation for employees around remote work, then you can and should address employee noncompliance directly and timely. Let me turn it back to Bob for our final substantive topic, which is protecting confidential employer data.
Amber, with regard to the last substantive topic we're going to discuss, I just want to touch briefly on data security in the world of remote work. Many of you have been talking repeatedly to your IT management staff since March 2020 about these issues, and I'm not going to retread all that ground. I just want to make the point that as cybercrime continues to grow in this country, the importance of assuring data security becomes all the more urgent. Also, I read continually about new devices that are becoming more prevalent in your employees' homes that make these security challenges even greater, the growing prevalence of smart speakers that may pick up confidential information that's discussed by your employees, the Wi-Fi enabled printers that may represent another point of a potential data breach. You're going to have to continue to work on these issues. And if we can turn to the next slide, let's just very quickly talk practically about what you can do. You might have done one-time training about this during the pandemic, maybe at the outset, about what your expectations for employees were. Well, now that training is going to have to become regular because remote work is not going away. You have to regularly remind employees about your expectations. You don't want, as remote work becomes a longer and longer term concept, there to be employees who are collecting more and more sensitive materials on their personal computer hard drives or collecting more and more company documents in their home office. They shouldn't be doing those things. And they're only going to know not to do those things if you remind them through ongoing training about your expectations with regard to data security. On this particular slide, you can see some other pieces of advice I have in this regard, but my key is you've got to remain vigilant about cybersecurity, and that means reminding employees again and again about the do's and don'ts to assure the security of the information that belongs to your company, to your customers, to your employees. Amber, let me turn things back to you.
Bob and I have discussed several issues over the course of this webinar and provided some practical considerations. But we wanted to conclude today with a few overall recommendations to evaluate and address issues related to long-term remote work arrangements. First, be clear about expectations related to remote work and consistently apply them. This provides the framework for employees and managers to understand the boundaries on remote work. Many employees are not trying to abuse remote work, but may be uncertain of the boundaries or need specific direction on expectations. Second, evaluate areas that are changing based on remote work and affirmatively address them through training or employee communications. As we have discussed today, this is an area that is changing, and both managers and employees are relearning aspects of work as their work environment changes. Remember that the considerations related to remote work will continue to change over time, which means that you will need to reassess these issues periodically going forward. Third, review and revise employment policies to incorporate remote work issues. Your organization may want to implement or revise a separate remote work policy or individual remote work agreements. Other policies, such as the discrimination and harassment policy, data security policy, or others, may also need to be updated to reflect new issues arising out of remote work. And fourth, support managers to communicate about remote work issues and be cognizant of remote work issues so that they can be addressed early. Remember that remote work creates new issues for managers that they may not have seen or addressed before. Your managers may need assistance to identify these issues and address them. Your managers may also need training or information about employment issues that come with remote work. Encourage your managers to raise issues and ask questions about remote work and to express what is and is not working about remote work arrangements with their subordinates. Consider including as an agenda item on management level meetings questions about remote work and the topics we've addressed today: facility safety, employee training, experiential learning, performance evaluation and proximity bias, employment law compliance related to remote work, company culture, and protecting confidential data, as well as other issues related to remote work that you are seeing at your company. Thank you for joining us. We hope this webinar has been helpful to you. Please feel free to reach out to either Bob or me with any questions.